Before I begin, hit that subscribe button. On today's decade debate, we're going to be talking about the 1980s, that great year of big hair bands and a lot of bad music, although my wife will completely disagree with me. What I wanted to do first was pick out 4 players from the decades, one NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL. But I didn't want to go with necessarily the top ones. I wanted to kind of get that B level or that 1A level. So I'm not including Wayne Gretzky. I'm not including Michaeljordan. I'm not including Joe Montana. And I'm not including Nolan Ryan. For this debate, we're going to pick out who was the most impactful player for their league in the 1980s. And the 4 players I've left or I've used, essentially because, number one, Wayne Gretzky was probably going to win it in that group because he had the championships and his move to Los Angeles opened up hockey for warm weather areas. Although Marcel Dion of the LA Kings probably would disagree with me, but he really brought hockey forward in Los Angeles and across the country, especially warm weather states. So the 4 players I'm going to be debating today. Number 1, all-time receiving record holder Jerry Rice. Number 2, Showtime Magic Johnson. Number 3, Mario Lemieux. And number 4, you got to think about 1980s baseball. Was there one really magical person outside of maybe Nolan Ryan? Maybe you have Mike Schmidt. Maybe you have Dwight Gooden. The player that came to mind because he started earlier in the 80s than like Dwight Gooden was Cal Ripken. So Jerry Rice, Magic Johnson, Mario Lemieux, Cal Ripken. I'm going to now, in reverse order, give you sort of their credentials and then show you how that debate will play out then. Okay, so let's start with Cal Ripken. Cal Ripken, I think, actually got his first game in 81. He was named the 1982 Rookie of the Year. He was named the 1983 MVP. And also in 1983, as you may or may not remember, the Baltimore Orioles, the team he played his entire career for, won the World Series. Now, another award that baseball players get, outside of Gold Glove, MVP, if you're a pitcher, Cy Young, are Silver Sluggers. Now, Cal Ripken won Silver Sluggers from 83 to 86 and then 89. So, you know, he was an all-star from 83 to 89, and he won. His only Gold Gloves came in the 90s, so we can't count those. So 1 championship, 1 Rookie of the Year, 1 MVP, a bunch of all-star games. So there's his block. So he had a lot of success early on. Now let's move to Mario Lemieux, who did not win a championship until the 90s. However, he was an all-star in 85, 86, 88, 89. He was Rookie of the Year. He was in hockey. I like hockey a lot. I don't understand their awards because he won the Ted Lindsay Award and he won the Hart Trophy, which are very similar. There's actually debate as to, or questions on Google of, as far as what is the difference between the two. But he won the Lindsay Award 85-86 season and 87-88. 87-88 he won the Hart Trophy, which I guess is the more prominent MVP, if you will. That's by the Pro Hockey Writers, and the Lindsay is by the NHL Players. So there's a little bit difference. He won the Rookie of the Year in 84-85. He was the points leader, the Art Ross Trophy in seasons 87-88 and 88-89. Again, no championships, a bunch of all-stars, a bunch of trophies. Let's say he won 1 to 3 MVPs, and he was the points leader in 2 seasons. Now, let's move on to the United States' biggest and favorite sport, the NFL. And let's talk about Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice had, just as a side note, 63-64. So 6,364 yards in the 80s. He had 66 touchdowns. He was named Rookie of the Year in 1985. He was the 1988 Super Bowl MVP. He never won regular season MVP or season MVP. He was the 87 Offensive Player of the Year. He was in Pro Bowls from 86 to 89. Now, his career started in 85, so he was mid-century, if you will. But he still put up big numbers. Now, he had been to Pro Bowls in 86, 89, and he had won championships in 88, 89, where he was the Super Bowl MVP in 88. So, we have Cal Ripken, Rookie of the Year, 1 championship, 1 MVP. We have Mario Lemieux with a debatable amount of MVPs, at least 1, if not 2 more. He was a points leader for 2 years, no championships. We have Jerry Rice, 2 championships, a Super Bowl MVP, and Rookie of the Year, and a bunch of Pro Bowls like the other players. Now, we move to the Magic Man, one of my favorites of all time. His smile alone made me want to watch him play. So, okay, so hold tight for a second here, because this is, to me, I'm kind of tipping my hat, but he was the 1980 Finals MVP. He was the 1982 Finals MVP. He was the 1987 Finals MVP. He won the MVP award for the NBA in the season of 86-87, 88-89, 89-90. He was an all-star pretty much every year that he wasn't hurt. So in 1980 and 82 through 89, so a bunch of years. And, okay, now some of you watching this know this, some of you don't. In the 1980s, okay, he won 5 championships. And he was the Finals MVP 3 of those championships. Now, you may argue that why did you take out Jordan and put in Magic? Because you really could swap the two. Well, you could also make the argument that Larry Bird should be in this discussion as well. I had to pick somebody that I really wanted to pick someone who'd played the majority of the early on, but not the entire 80s. So I wanted someone like a Bird. I wanted someone like Magic for this. I knew that most people would say Michael would be top of the food chain because he was started in the early 80s and people would pick him. But I have to tell you right now that pound for pound, Magic Johnson, in my estimation, and please put this in the comments, please talk about this as much as you possibly can, but I have to tell you that Magic Johnson was the most dominant, the most impactful player of the 80s for his league. Now, Boston Celtics fans will tell me that it was Larry Bird. I'm telling you that it was Magic Johnson because of the Finals MVP. It was 1980. He was a rookie, essentially, and he won the Finals MVP. So now he lost out the Rookie of the Year to Larry Bird, and that's always been in debate as well. But I have to tell you, he won the Finals MVP in his rookie season, and if you remember, the clinching game was when he played center for the injured Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So he even played out of position to win that thing, and you really got to give him credit for that. And overall, not the highest scorer in the league, obviously. There was a lot of competition back then, but he had lots of assists. He led the league in assists a number of times, 2 to 3 times, I think it was, in the 80s. So just a tremendous player, and in my estimation, of these 4 players, the most impactful. And dare I even say that you could make the argument that if Wayne Gretzky is number one for the decade, and I believe that he would be, and the reason that I might not give it to Magic because of the 5 championships, the finals MVP, and all of those things, is because he also had to deal with Larry Bird. And Larry Bird, you know, you could put in Larry Bird's name for Magic's name, and probably have him win out of these 4 players, and quite possibly win or come close to Wayne Gretzky. Now, if you put Magic and Larry as one person against Wayne Gretzky, obviously they win. But overall, I would say Wayne was number one, and then the debate rages on. Is it Wayne and then Michael and Joe Montana and Nolan Ryan? Where does Jerry Rice come in? Where does Magic come in? Lemieux come in? Cal Ripken come in? But of the 4 players I just talked about, I would definitely say that Magic Johnson is the one that did the best out of those 4 players, and probably pushes Wayne Gretzky at the same time. So, all right, moving on. Next subject, we're going to talk about the impact of the 80s from a single game standpoint. Players that had the greatest games in the 1980s. Now, this is going to run the gambit as well. There's not 1 or 2 or 3. This can be highly debated. Okay, so we're going to start off in hockey, only because, well, I guess because I sort of know this answer, or I know what happened in the 80s, and it wasn't necessarily record setting. Now, I didn't pull goalie records. For the NHL, I pulled points per game and goals per game, which really are about the same, because there was only one player in the 80s, Mario Lemieux, who had 5 goals, which is number 2 all-time in hockey. 5 goals in a game, and number 2, tied for many people, 8 points in a game. So he had 5 goals and 3 assists in 2 games in the 80s. 1 in 88, 1 in 89. Bernie Nichols of the LA Kings had 8 points. Patrick Sundstrom of the New Jersey Devils had 8 points in 1988. Paul Coffey had 8 points in 86. Wayne Gretzky had 8 points in 83 and 84. And then the Stastny brothers and their Quebec Nordiques did a job on a team on February 22nd, 1981. They both recorded 8 points in the same game for the same team. So the 2 of them combined for 16 points, which is probably in and of itself a record. 2 players of the same team, highest number of points. I can't imagine it going higher than 16 points. So tremendous, and hats off to them. However, the all-time goals per game and the all-time points per game go to one player from 1976, and that's Daryl Sittler. He had 10 points and 6 goals. So everyone I mentioned had less points in a game in the 80s, and they had less goals than Daryl Sittler. So they're tied for number 2, if you will, in goals. So no one in the 80s for the NHL set one of those marks for single game records that crushes it. Not one of those big numbers. Now again, I did not pull number of saves. That's my short-sightedness, so I apologize for that. But when it comes to points, and we always pretty much think of points, who scored this, who scored that, who scored the winning goal, who, a lot of times we'll the goalie is the afterthought in all of this. So now let's jump to the NBA, and the debate I was having a little bit earlier between the 4 top A players from the various leagues versus the 1A players from the various leagues. This is one reason why Jordan would probably push what I was talking about with Magic Johnson against Wayne Gretzky. In the playoffs in the 80s, in 1986 to be specific, Michael Jordan against the Boston Celtics recorded 63 points, which was 2 points higher than Elgin Baylor's record in the playoffs of 61 points. The game against the Bulls, or the game of the Bulls and the Celtics, was a 2 overtime game, so he had a little bit more time, and he scored about 9 points in the overtime. He had 54 in regulation and ended up with 63. So he scored 9 points then in the overtime. So it gave him a little bit more time to get those numbers up. But that's still a record today, the 63 points. So that's one of those big numbers out there. That's that one number that you still hear about. 63 points in a playoff game by Michael Jordan, 1986. Now, when it goes to points in a game for the NBA, we all think of Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain, 100 points. Boom, that's what it was. Well, in the 1980s, the closest a player got to that, meaning the most points in a regular season game by a player, was 61 points in 1987 by Michael Jordan. So this pushes that number, that idea of the impact of Michael Jordan a little bit higher than just not winning any championships. He has that playoff record, and in all of the 80s, he had the most points in one game. So there is that, at least, for him. Now, let's move on to the NFL. And I tried to be a little comprehensive, a little bit more than I guess I was in the NHL. What I picked were who in the 80s, and let's think about it. The biggest stats in the NFL are rushing yards in a game, receiving yards in a game, and passing yards in a game. It could be touchdowns or something like that, but I went with the number of yards in those three categories. And I would say that, first of all, in rushing yards in a game in the 1980s, there's no rusher, there's no running back who was in the top 20 of rushing yards in a game. So that disqualifies any running back or anyone who ran the ball in the 80s then for that category. Now, for passing yards, we think of one person in the 80s, and you would be 1,000% probably correct. Maybe two people, but the big one, Dan Marino, he passed for 521 yards in 88. And the second best in the 80s was 513 yards by Phil Simms. However, to qualify that, it still does not come that close to the overall record, which was surprisingly set in 1951 by Norm Van Brocklin. He had 554 yards passing. So I would say that record, it's great that he had 521 yards, but I wouldn't say that that's the record that has to be out there, and that's the one that's so important, because it's not really a record. He's in fifth or sixth, I think it is, Dan Marino, for that. So now, when it comes to receiving yards, there is a push for the Michael Jordan playoff number. Believe it or not, in 1989, Willie Flipper Anderson for the Los Angeles Rams had 336 receiving yards in a game. 336. Now, that's a record that still stands today. That is the most receiving yards in a game. 336 by Flipper Anderson in 89. 63 points in a playoff game by Michael Jordan in 86. Now, the one thing I forgot to mention about Michael Jordan is they ended up losing that series. They ended up losing that game. So it was all for naught, if you will. Some people say that he might have been a ball hog at that point in his career, but he did have, I believe, 6 assists and 5 rebounds or something like that. So he did play a little bit more of a team game. So right now, I would say that the Jordan playoff record and the Flipper Anderson receiving yardage record are the two tops. so far, because they're records that are still the top number today. No one's come close. Okay, now baseball. Let's get to that. Okay, so first I wanted to look at, I didn't want to do cycle, hitting for the cycle. I didn't really care about that because that happens multiple times a year, every other year, something like that. I wanted to maybe think about who had 4 home runs in a game because that is the number that, is a big number. And it happened once in the 80s, and it happened by an Atlanta Brave by the name of Bob Horner, who played first base and third base. He had 4 home runs on July 6th, 1986. So there is a pattern here. There's a lot of 86 records with Jordan and Horner. Now, another statistic that I think is important in baseball is the number of strikeouts by a pitcher in a 9-inning game. And that was Roger Clemens had 20 in a 1986 game for the Boston Red Sox. He did it again actually 10 years later. He is tied for the lead. He does not have the lead in that with several other players, Kerry Wood I think being one of them with the Chicago Cubs. And then just to do a little bit more stat searching, I figured that if you truly want to say who had the best game as a pitcher, because what is the best game as a hitter? Is it being 5 for 5 and hitting 5 singles, and is it that plus RBIs plus home runs? What makes the hitter great? And I reduced it down to home runs in a game because I think really as a society that's what we look at on a constant basis is home runs in a game. We're all about the home run, especially in today's game. So I didn't look at people who went 5 for 5. I think there's probably a lot of that goes on. It would be almost like looking for a needle in a haystack, comparing those. However, for pitching, outside of strikeouts, what is better for a pitcher than a perfect game? Now, there were 3 perfect games in the 80s. The first one was Len Barker of the Cleveland, back then, Indians. He had 103 pitches, very, very efficient. 103 pitches for a perfect game. Think about it. He had 11 strikeouts, and they won 3-0, and that happened in 1981. Now, in 1984, the California Angels, today the Los Angeles Angels, Mike Witt won his perfect game, 1-0, with 94 pitches, even more efficient, and 10 strikeouts. And then finally, Tom Browning, the lefty with the Cincinnati Reds, did this in 1988. He won 1-0. So another pitcher's duel. You got to give respect for whoever the other pitchers were, the other team was. Both Witt and Browning won only 1-0. So there wasn't a lot of margin for error there. Now Browning did it with 100 pitches and only 7 strikeouts. But overall, I would say, a perfect game is one remarkable talent, historic record for a pitcher. However, they've happened. I think there's been 20 of them. So it's essentially a tie. The home runs with Bob Horner, a tie. Roger Clemens in the strikeouts, a tie. Marino's like in 5th or 6th place. Michael Jordan, number 1 in playoff points. Regular season game, he's way down there. Flipper Anderson, number 1 in receiving yards. And then you have a bunch of people in the NHL with 8 points, 5 goals. The 8 points is a tie for second, and the 5 goals is a tie for second. So it stays down to the Flipper Anderson versus Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was in a playoff game. Flipper Anderson was in a regular season game. Obviously, because of that, because of when the games took place in proximity to the regular season, that being a playoff game for Jordan, I would have to say that he wins because it's a playoff game, and he set the record at 63 for a playoff game. Now, You could bring up the fact that it was double overtime. Flipper Anderson didn't go to overtime. So it is something that you would have to look at. But I will say that I could hear the argument either way. So let me know what you're thinking on this, okay? I think that I'd love to hear the debate. And maybe I missed one. Maybe I missed something with the goalies. And you know what? I didn't necessarily do that out of just being stupid. I wanted someone to come up with something to say, hey, you forgot this, you forgot that. What about this guy? What about that guy? What about Billy Smith scored a goal? What about that? The Islanders goalie, but I can't remember if it happened in the 80s or in like 79. So anyway, so last item for the decade debate show. And this is where I take one event from the decade and I sort of put it under the microscope because it had one of the biggest impacts of the decade. And I reduced this down to two events, both of them being Olympic events. I had the 1980 hockey team and the 1984 Olympics. I know that that's somewhat not fair because I'm comparing an entire Olympics to, a series of games. But I would say that as the impact, the biggest impact was probably, realistically, the 1984 Olympics. Now, I know the 80 hockey team is in all U.S. citizens' hearts. I was alive back then, and I can't tell you, how excited I was for all of that and how I got swept up in all of it. And I wanted to know all about it. And I've watched the movies and the documentaries and read the books. And, Michael Ruzioni is a name that, Jim Craig is a name that I will never forget. What they looked like back then, their jerseys, all of those kinds of things. So look, I have the utmost of respect for the 1980 Olympic hockey team, Herb Brooks and all of those guys. Loved it, enjoyed it, but I have to give it to the 84 Olympics. And part of the reason here is the 84 Olympics, and I'm just kind of going to go through this from an arm's length. Peter Uberalt, who was basically the mind behind the 84 LA Summer Olympics, commercialized the Olympics. He made it very sponsored, if you will, and it was a big portion of those games. He needed to raise the money. He did. He found the sponsorships. He changed the way the Olympics were up until that point. They were still sort of seen as this big celebration of amateur athletes. And he said, in a way, hey, we can celebrate these amateur athletes. However, at the same time, we can also bring in and make money doing it. We can raise money doing it. We can get corporate sponsors. People watch this. Why not make a few dollars off of it? Why not charge more people, more companies rather, for their sponsorships? And so I just have to tell you that I chose the 84 Olympics primarily for one huge memory that I had. Now, Peter Uberalt changed it. He ended up being the Major League Baseball commissioner. I mean, he was just a really forward-thinking individual, bringing sponsorships of high value to the Olympics, okay? So he really changed the dynamic, the environment of the Olympics. So there's that off the top. Now, one of the things that I guess him and his team or someone from his team pushed for, the sponsorships that I'm talking about, one of them was the McDonald's sponsorship. Now, some of you may laugh, some of you may have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, let me just give you a little background before I go into this. In 1976, for the Olympics, McDonald's fast food restaurants created a giveaway program for those Olympics that were in Montreal. Customers were offered a chance to win products when the American team won a medal. So in 1976, The U.S. team won 94 medals, 34 of which were gold medals. So essentially, back then, 76-ish, you got a Big Mac if they won gold, you got fries if they won silver, you got bronze, or you got a drink if they won bronze. That's what it was. Well, in 1980, the U.S. team boycotted the Olympics. Basically, it was a political stand that the president took against the Russians for various activities they were doing, and so they boycotted. So in 1984, just before the Olympics, Russia and its allies, its sister countries, whatever you want to call it, boycotted the 1984 LA Olympics. And therein lies McDonald's biggest issues. The reason I say that is because, unlike 1976, where the U.S. team won 94 medals, the 1984, so in 76 they won 94, in 84 they won a whopping 174 medals. 83 of them were gold. So they doubled the medal count and almost, a little less, but almost tripled the gold medal count. Now you have to remember, when the U.S. won a gold medal, you got a free Big Mac, which was, well, it's still their big product, you know? It still is. So there were actual restaurants. There were 6,600 franchisees that said they were selling out of Big Macs. 6,600. They were facing shortages of these products. Okay, they were facing shortages of these products, predominantly the Big Mac. It is said, and McDonald's has never been clear with any of this, that not only was it the biggest blunder, giveaway blunder of their history, but it probably cost them millions of dollars. Now, I remember in '84, because I was, I wasn't quite a teenager, but I was pretty close. I remember going to McDonald's and having an entire meal for free, and actually going back and like getting a second fry and a drink because I had enough tickets because we won enough medals. Not to mention, I was really into the '84 Olympics. You had Carl Lewis, you had Jackie Joyner-Kersee, you had Mary Lou Retton. You had a lot of great stories there. You had a baseball team in '84 that played and did pretty well. So I think Mark McGuire and like Will Clark were on that team. So now McDonald's did do this. They did do this later on. They did this in '88 and '96, the same giveaway, which back in '76 it was called the same thing. When the U.S. wins, you win. So they did in '88 and '96, and then they stopped sponsoring the Olympics in 2017. You would have thought it might have been 1984, 1985 when they stopped sponsoring the Olympics, but it wasn't. So McDonald's gave away double the amount of products as they thought they would, and of the products they gave away, it was almost 2.5. It was at least 2.5, almost 3 times the amount of Big Macs that they had to give away because of all the gold medals. You look at a sport like gymnastics, where the U.S. had never won gold, and they won gold in gymnastics. So they went from like a bronze, silver. When Russia didn't show up for gymnastics, they became the odds-on favorites, and the men's and women's team were very successful that year. So it's just one of those things. Peter Ueberroth made it this wonderful Olympics, and everyone was praising him and the sponsorships and the money he created from the '84 Olympics. And McDonald's had this side note that did not quite go their way and cost them millions of dollars according to most experts, a number that they've never and probably will never confirm. So I wanted to thank you all for watching. Please hit that subscribe button. Would love to have you around for more. Thank you very much.